He had just watched 80,000 people die in a single flash of light, and the first thing his government did was give him a medal. Then, 10 years later, they took everything from him because he dared to say it might happen again. That is the Oppenheimer story nobody fully tells you. And before this is over, I am going to show you exactly who set the trap, how long they had been building it, and why the most brilliant scientific mind America ever weaponized ended up being treated like a criminal for the sin of having a conscience. This is not just a story about a bomb. It is a story about what governments do with dangerous geniuses once the danger is over. And the answer, it turns out, is deeply uncomfortable. Julius Robert Oppenheimer was born in New York City on April 22, 1904, into a wealthy family with no religious practice and an apartment full of Van Gogh originals. That detail matters more than it seems. He grew up surrounded by beauty, by intellectual ambition, by the idea that the life of the mind was the only life worth living. He was reading Greek philosophy at 9 years old. Not because someone told him to, because he was bored. His father once said, somewhat helplessly, that the boy simply could not be satisfied with anything ordinary, which, as parenting observations go, turned out to be one of history's great understatements. He studied at Harvard, then Cambridge, then Göttingen in Germany, where he picked up quantum mechanics the way most people pick up a new language on vacation irritatingly fast and with suspiciously good pronunciation. By the time he was 27 years old, he had helped lay the theoretical foundations for black holes, neutron stars, and quantum tunneling. He was, by any honest measure, operating in a different intellectual atmosphere than the rest of humanity. One physicist who worked with him in those early years said that talking to Oppenheimer felt like watching someone read a book you had not written yet. He took a joint appointment at Berkeley and Caltech in 1929, and he spent the next decade building one of the most important theoretical physics programs in American history. He was not just brilliant, he was magnetic. Students followed him between campuses. He introduced American physicists to European quantum theory. He threw dinner parties where people argued about Marxism and Sanskrit and the thermodynamics of stars, sometimes in the same sentence. He was the kind of man who made everyone in the room feel like they were finally having the right conversation. And here is where the story starts to get complicated, because this is also when Oppenheimer got close to communism. Not secretly, not through back channels, not in a sinister way, openly, politically. His girlfriend was a member of the Communist Party. His brother Frank was a member. Several of his close friends were members. He attended meetings. He donated money. He was, by his own later admission, politically engaged in ways that made sense to a lot of left-leaning intellectuals in the 1930s. When fascism was rising in Europe, the Spanish Civil War was being fought with no help from the American government. And the New Deal was the closest thing the country had to a social safety net. He was never, as far as anyone has ever been able to prove with actual evidence, a Soviet spy. That distinction is going to matter enormously in about 15 minutes. By 1942, the United States government had a problem. They knew the Germans were trying to build a nuclear weapon. They knew the physics was sound. They knew that whoever built it first would effectively own the outcome of the war. And they needed someone to run the scientific operation that would get there before Berlin did. They needed someone who could manage hundreds of the world's most ego-driven, independently minded, brilliantly obstinate physicists and somehow convince them to work together toward a single goal. They needed someone who was not just a great scientist, but a great leader. They chose Oppenheimer. This is the part that still astonishes me. The man they chose to build the most destructive weapon in human history was a man the FBI had been monitoring for years due to his communist associations. General Leslie Groves, the military director of the Manhattan Project, essentially overrode his own security apparatus to hire him. Groves later said that Oppenheimer was the only man who could do it. The security concerns were noted. Then they were set aside. Then they were filed somewhere very carefully to be retrieved later. The Los Alamos laboratory was built from nothing in the New Mexico desert starting in 1943. Oppenheimer ran it with an intensity that people who were there still struggle to describe decades later. He worked 18-hour days. He memorized every sub-project. He moved between theoretical physics and engineering and logistics and personnel management with a fluency that should not have been humanly possible. He lost 30 pounds in the first year. He chain smoked. He was everywhere at once, somehow, in a facility spread across miles of high desert. More than 6,000 people eventually worked at Los Alamos. Oppenheimer knew most of them by name. He knew their research, their anxieties, their personal problems. When people hit walls, he did not just manage them, he sat down and thought alongside them. Richard Feynman, who would go on to become one of the most celebrated physicists of the 20th century, said that Oppenheimer's ability to absorb a problem he had never encountered and immediately begin contributing to its solution was unlike anything he had ever seen. Feynman was not easily impressed by anyone. That quote should tell you something. Now, I want to tell you something about what was happening on the other side of the project, because this is where the subplot enters and it runs straight through to the end of the story. His name was Louis Strauss. At this point in 1943, Strauss was not yet in a position to do much about Oppenheimer, but he was watching. He was always watching. Strauss was a self-made businessman who had worked his way into the upper tiers of American government through a combination of genuine intelligence and a breathtaking sensitivity to personal slights. He remembered every slight. He cataloged them. He was, in many ways, the kind of man you pray you never sit across from in a negotiation. Not because he was loud or aggressive, but because he was quiet, patient, and he never, ever forgot. The two men had met before the war. Oppenheimer had once, in a government meeting, casually dismantled one of Strauss's technical arguments in front of a room full of people. He had done it correctly, by all accounts. The physics was on his side. He had also done it in a way that left Strauss looking uninformed in front of an audience that included some of the most powerful figures in American science and government. Whether Oppenheimer intended any cruelty is debated. What is not debated is what Strauss decided that day. He decided he would wait. Keep that name in your memory. Louis Strauss. We are coming back to him, and when we do, the whole story changes shape. July 16, 1945. 5:30 in the morning in the Jornada del Muerto Desert in New Mexico, the Trinity test, the world's first nuclear detonation. The bomb, called the gadget because apparently the people building it needed some psychological distance from what they were actually doing, was mounted on a 100-foot steel tower. The scientists watched from 10 miles away. Some of them bet on the yield. One physicist bet that it would ignite the atmosphere and destroy all life on Earth. His colleagues found this less funny than he apparently did. The flash was visible from over 100 miles away. The shockwave knocked people down at 10 miles. The mushroom cloud rose 40,000 feet. The steel tower was vaporized. The sand beneath it fused into a green glass the scientists later named Trinity. The yield was equivalent to roughly 21,000 tons of TNT. Oppenheimer, watching from the bunker, said nothing for a long time. Then he said, quietly, that a line from the Bhagavad Gita had come into his mind. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. He did not say it triumphantly. He did not say it with relief. Years later, in an interview, he described his own expression in that moment as simply, it worked. And then he said, he thought we knew the world would not be the same. A few people laughed. A few people cried. Most people were silent. I want to stop here for a second, because what happened next is one of the most important and least discussed sequences in the entire story. Less than 3 weeks after Trinity, on August 6th, 1945, the bomb called Little Boy was dropped on Hiroshima. 80,000 people died instantly. Another 30,000 to 60,000 died within months from radiation and injuries. On August 9th, Nagasaki, between 40,000 and 80,000 people dead. Japan surrendered. On August 15th, the war was over. Oppenheimer was celebrated as a hero. President Truman awarded him the Medal for Merit. The cover of Time magazine. The man who ended the war. America's greatest scientist. He was 31 years old when he took over Los Alamos and 41 years old when the bomb fell. He had done the impossible, on time, under impossible conditions, and the government he had served was delighted. And then something happened that the celebration could not quite contain. Oppenheimer started talking. Not recklessly, not carelessly, but honestly. He told government officials that the atomic bomb was not a stable deterrent, that the logic of "we have it, so we are safe" was going to break down the moment someone else had it too. He said America should not assume its monopoly on nuclear weapons would last. He said the Soviet Union would develop their own bomb, probably faster than most people expected, and that the United States needed an international framework for controlling nuclear technology before that happened rather than after. He became one of the founding architects of the Atomic Energy Act of 1946. He served as chairman of the General Advisory Committee of the newly formed Atomic Energy Commission, which became the AEC. He was, in other words, doing exactly what you would want the man who built the bomb to do. He was thinking about consequences. He was taking responsibility. He was using his credibility to argue for restraint. Here is where it gets interesting, and I mean that quite literally, because what I am about to tell you reshapes everything. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested their first nuclear weapon. The CIA detected it. The government was shocked, though Oppenheimer had warned them it was coming. The question then became, what do we do now? The Air Force and a group of political hawks argued for an immediate program to build the hydrogen bomb, a thermonuclear weapon that would make the Hiroshima bomb look like a firework. Oppenheimer was on the advisory committee that would recommend the course of action. And his recommendation was no. Not because he was soft, not because he was naive, because he ran the numbers and concluded that a thermonuclear arms race was a dead end. He argued that the United States should focus on building a large and strategically flexible conventional nuclear arsenal, rather than pursuing a single catastrophic weapon that could only ever be used to kill millions of civilians at once. He called the hydrogen bomb, in a phrase that would later be used against him, a weapon that could only be described as a genocide weapon. Edward Teller, the physicist who would become the hydrogen bomb's most passionate advocate, disagreed. Teller had wanted to work on thermonuclear weapons during the Manhattan Project and had been frustrated when Oppenheimer redirected his energies. Teller believed the H-bomb was not just buildable, but necessary. The tension between Teller and Oppenheimer had been building for years here was the moment it broke open. Truman ignored the advisory committee's recommendation. He authorized the hydrogen bomb program in January 1950. The decision was made. Oppenheimer did not publicly oppose it after the decision. He accepted the outcome and continued serving on the committee. But his enemies had noted the recommendation. They had noted every recommendation. And Lewis Strauss, who was by now becoming one of the most powerful figures in American nuclear policy, had filed it alongside every other note in his very careful, very long memory. 1953. Dwight Eisenhower is president. The Cold War is in full paranoid bloom. Joseph McCarthy is holding hearings. The country is in a state of anxious suspicion that makes it easy to destroy anyone with the right label attached to their name. Oppenheimer's security clearance comes up for renewal. William Borden, a former staff director of the Joint Congressional Committee on Atomic Energy, sends a letter to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. In it, he writes that, based on his review of the evidence, it was more probable than not that J. Robert Oppenheimer was a Soviet agent. This letter was based on files the FBI had been building for over a decade, files that included Oppenheimer's communist associations from the 1930s, a confusing episode involving a Soviet recruitment attempt in 1943 that Oppenheimer had reported himself, and the accumulated suspicions of people who had never liked him. Eisenhower, upon receiving a summary of the Borden letter, ordered a blank wall placed between Oppenheimer and any classified information. His clearance was suspended pending an investigation. What followed was one of the most extraordinary and disturbing legal proceedings in the history of American science. The hearing was conducted by the Personnel Security Board of the Atomic Energy Commission. It ran from April 12 to May 6, 1954. 3 men sat in judgment. Roger Robb, the government's attorney, had been given access to classified transcripts of conversations Oppenheimer had with his attorneys, transcripts that Oppenheimer's own legal team had not seen. Think about that for a moment. The prosecutor knew what the defense had said in private. Yep, you heard that right. The deck was not just stacked. It had been shuffled by someone who had already seen all the cards. Witnesses testified on both sides. Many of Oppenheimer's former colleagues came forward to vouch for his loyalty. But the most devastating testimony came from Edward Teller. Teller told the board that he had no specific evidence of disloyalty on Oppenheimer's part, but that he would feel more secure if the country's vital interests were in other hands. That sentence, that single, careful, calibrated sentence, it was not an accusation. It was worse than an accusation. It was a suggestion wrapped in plausible deniability. The scientific community never forgave Teller for it. For the rest of his life, many of his colleagues refused to speak to him. At a ceremony decades later, when Teller was given a Lifetime Achievement Award, several physicists walked out of the room. Oppenheimer testified for days. He was calm, precise, self-critical in ways that were sometimes used against him. He acknowledged mistakes. He acknowledged that he had lied to security officials in 1943 about the details of the Soviet recruitment attempt. He had initially given a vague account, and then, when pressed, given a clearer one, and the discrepancy had been noted and weaponized. He acknowledged his left-wing associations. He was, in some respects, too honest for a proceeding that was not designed to reward honesty. The board voted 2-1 to revoke his security clearance. Not because he was found to be a spy, not because any specific act of treason was established. The majority finding was, essentially, that Oppenheimer had demonstrated fundamental defects in character and that his judgment could not be trusted. The dissenting board member, Ward Evans, wrote that he found the whole proceeding a shabby affair and that Oppenheimer had been more than loyal. He had given generously of his time and talent. Evans was outvoted. The AEC then voted 4-1 to uphold the revocation. The one dissenting vote came from Henry Smith, who wrote that the evidence against Oppenheimer did not hold up under scrutiny and that the proceeding had been, in his assessment, fundamentally unfair. Oppenheimer's career in government was over. He was 50 years old. Here is what I want you to sit with for a moment, because this is the thing that changes how you see the whole arc of the story. The man who had been the most valuable scientific asset in American history, the man who had delivered the weapon that ended World War II, who had then spent the next 9 years trying to prevent the next one, who had advised presidents and shaped policy and run the country's most important scientific advisory body, that man was destroyed not because he had done anything treasonous. He was destroyed because he had been inconvenient, because his judgment contradicted the judgments of people with more political power and fewer scruples. Because Louis Strauss had been waiting since 1947, when Oppenheimer had once again made him look uninformed in a public hearing, this time over the question of exporting radioactive isotopes to Allied nations. Because the Cold War had created an atmosphere in which the mere act of urging caution could be characterized as softness, and softness could be characterized as sympathy, and sympathy could be characterized as treason. The system did not fail Oppenheimer by accident. It failed him on purpose, and the people who ran it knew exactly what they were doing. I told you we would come back to Louis Strauss. Here he is. By 1954, Strauss was chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission. He was the man who oversaw the hearing. He was, in the judgment of almost every serious historian who has examined the record, the architect of Oppenheimer's destruction. Not the only one. The Cold War paranoia was real, and there were genuine hawks who distrusted Oppenheimer on policy grounds. But Strauss was the one who had the motive, the position, and the patience. He was the one who had been building this particular case since the late 1940s. The irony, and I want you to feel the full weight of this irony, is that Strauss himself eventually faced a reckoning. In 1959, Eisenhower nominated him for Secretary of Commerce. The Senate confirmation hearings gave Oppenheimer's allies a chance they had never had before. Clinton Anderson, a senator from New Mexico, the state where Los Alamos stood, where the Trinity test had happened, where the bomb had been born, led the opposition. The Senate rejected Strauss's nomination by 3 votes. It was the first time in 34 years that a cabinet nomination had been rejected by the Senate. Strauss spent the rest of his life insisting that he had done nothing wrong regarding Oppenheimer. Almost nobody believed him. After 1954, Oppenheimer retreated to the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, where he had been director since 1947. He continued to work. He continued to think. He gave lectures. He wrote. He was, by all accounts, a man carrying something that never fully lifted. He described the experience of the hearing as painful beyond anything I'd expected. He told friends that what hurt most was not the political outcome, but the personal betrayals, the colleagues who had chosen silence, the former students who had given testimony that they knew was being used selectively, the institution he had served that had treated his loyalty as a liability. He also continued, right up until the end, to believe that science had an obligation to the world it changed. He gave a famous lecture series at Harvard in 1957 on physics and culture, arguing that the atomic age demanded a new kind of public responsibility from scientists, that you could not simply build something and then wash your hands of what it became. He said that the physicists had known sin and that this was a knowledge they could not lose. That phrase, "the physicists have known sin," is probably the most honest thing anyone connected to the Manhattan Project ever said publicly. Not guilt, exactly. Not regret in the ordinary sense. Sin. The word carries weight. It carries the idea that something was done that could not be undone, that the world had changed in a way that demanded an accounting that science alone could not provide. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy announced that Oppenheimer would receive the Fermi Award, the Atomic Energy Commission's highest honor. It was, transparently, a rehabilitation. Kennedy was assassinated before the ceremony could be held. Lyndon Johnson presented the award in December of that year. Oppenheimer accepted it quietly. He was 59 years old and had been chain-smoking for decades. He died of throat cancer on February 18, 1967. He was 62 years old. 50 years later, in December 2022, the Department of Energy officially vacated the 1954 security decision. They declared it null and void. They said the process had been fundamentally unfair, that the rules had been violated, that Oppenheimer had been denied due process. A formal vindication 6 decades after the fact, delivered to a man who had been dead for 55 years. I find myself returning to a specific question every time I think about this story, and it is not the question most people ask. Most people ask whether Oppenheimer regretted building the bomb. I think the more interesting question is what he regretted more, the bomb itself, or the fact that building it had given him access to a conversation about what came next, a conversation he then tried to have honestly and was punished for it so completely that the punishment became inseparable from the weapon itself. Because here's the thing. He did not regret the bomb in a simple way. He believed at the time that it was necessary. He believed the alternative, a continued conventional war, a land invasion of Japan, the possibility of a German nuclear weapon, was worse. He accepted that the deaths in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were connected to his decisions and lived with that knowledge. What he could not accept, what he spent the rest of his career fighting against, was the idea that the bomb was just a bigger weapon and that the logic of bigger weapons would keep the world safe indefinitely. He thought that logic was going to kill everybody. He said so, clearly, repeatedly, and to the people with the authority to do something about it. And for that, they destroyed him. There's something almost elegant in the cruelty of it. He was right about the Soviet bomb. They built it on schedule, or ahead of schedule, exactly as he had warned. He was right about the arms race. It escalated exactly as he had predicted. He was right that a thermonuclear arsenal of world-ending size was not a security strategy, but a suicide pact with extra steps. History vindicated essentially every major policy position he took between 1945 and 1954. None of that mattered in 1954. What mattered was that he had made powerful people uncomfortable. And in Washington in 1954, making powerful people uncomfortable was the one thing you could not do and survive. The subplot I asked you to carry Lewis Strauss, the man with the long memory and the careful files, resolves in the only way these things ever really resolve. He lost. Not in 1954, when he had the power, and Oppenheimer did not. But slowly, over years, as the historical record accumulated and the full picture became visible, he lost the cabinet nomination. He lost the argument with history. He died in 1974, still insisting he had been misunderstood, still insisting the hearing had been fair, still insisting Oppenheimer had been a genuine security risk. No serious historian agrees with him. The man who had waited years to destroy the most brilliant scientist America ever produced spent his last years being remembered primarily for having destroyed the most brilliant scientist America ever produced. That is not justice, exactly, but it is something. I opened this by saying Oppenheimer was given a medal for watching 80,000 people die in a flash of light, and then had everything taken from him for telling the truth about what that flash meant for the future. I want to close by adding one thing I left out. In the days after Trinity, after the bomb had worked and before it had been used, Oppenheimer sent a memo to the government outlining the scale of what was about to happen. He was not trying to stop it. The decision had been made. He was trying to ensure that whoever made the decision understood exactly what they were authorizing. He wanted there to be no ambiguity about the human cost. He wanted it on record that he had said, "Here is what this is." He built the thing that changed the world. Then he spent the rest of his life trying to make sure the people who had the power to use it could not claim they did not understand it. That is not regret, exactly. It is something harder, something closer to responsibility. The kind that follows you whether you want it to or not, whether it saves anything or not, whether anyone is listening or not. They stopped listening. They took away his clearance and called it a security matter and moved on to the next thing. And 58 years after they did it, a government department quietly put a piece of paper in a file that said, "We were wrong." The destroyer of worlds spent his life trying to save it. The people who could have helped him win that argument spent their time making sure he could not speak. That is the bomb nobody ever talks about.